Hoping that the whole makes sense. By So Do Roses. Summary. Is it still a secret if you don't know you're keeping it? It is. God, it is. The rating for this fic is teen and up, with an archive warning of creator chose not to use archive warnings. The relationships in this fic are Roman/Logan and Logan and Thomas Sanders, and Virgil/Roman/Logan/Patton, and Roman/Deceit. Additional tags. I'm tagging the pinned seat so y'all know it's there, but it's abusive AF, just so you know. Non-consensual kissing, non-consensual touching, manipulation, emotional manipulation, gaslighting, dubious consent, mentions of murder, mentions of execution, angst and hurt comfort. Chapter 1. Logan was not a jittery person. He was calm, precise. He had to be. Losing control of his emotions tended to result in a variety of unfortunate accidents, and therefore it was Logan's responsibility to keep them in check. The fact that he never attempted to do homework on the nights of the full moon was irrelevant. It was for Thomas's benefit, not his own. Thomas always spent the evening wound tight as a spring, and he never slept unless it was unintentional. If Logan did not spend the evening soothing him, Thomas was liable to work himself into a truly disastrous state. And lastly, the fact that Logan had never tried to say any of this out loud, where there might, theoretically, be potential for him to be cut off by his ridiculous physiology, also meant nothing. They were both in Logan's bed, Logan across the headboard and Thomas laying on his stomach across Logan's feet. Logan could not imagine it was a comfortable position, but Thomas seemed content enough. He didn't squirm or fidget. He had his chin resting on his folded arms and his eyes focused on the wall. "Hey, Barry?" he said. Logan startled. "Yes?" "Is there something you want to tell me?" Thomas said, hesitant. Logan tilted his head, confused. "What do you mean?" "Well," said Thomas wearily, "it's just that your headboard has started growing Christmas roses." Baffled, Logan turned, and sure enough, there were dozens of hellebore blossoms growing around his head, pink and white and violet and a few pale green. Logan scowled. "It's a new one," said Thomas dryly. "Correct," grumbled Logan, "and yet again a poison." Thomas winced. "So we have hyacinth when you cry, monkshood when you're angry, and Christmas roses when—" "Why does it matter?" Logan snapped petulantly. "I have no desire to analyze the circumstances of this metaphorical floral mood ring." "Well, it's not like you give the rest of us much else to go on," Thomas said, exasperated. Instead of responding, Logan began furiously yanking the roots of the flowers from the headboard. Thomas groaned in frustration and scrubbed his hands down his face. I feel like I barely know you anymore," he said weakly. Logan paused. "We used to tell each other everything, whenever something was going on, both of us. And now I feel like trying to get you to tell me anything is like pulling teeth," he continued. "And today, Logan, what were you thinking?" "I explained," said Logan. "I recognized the dubious morality of my actions." "Recognized it but didn't care?" said Thomas, and his voice was becoming a touch hysterical. "Because that's not better." "I apologized as best I could." "An apology doesn't mean anything if you're just going to do it again." "If it makes you feel any better," Logan spat nastily. "I doubt I'll ever be in close enough physical proximity to Patton to do it again." "Oh my goodness gracious, that's my point, you dense!" Thomas clambered off the bed, striding to the door and throwing it open. "You are so worried about losing all of us," he said, and his voice was colder than Logan had ever heard it, "that you're going to push everyone away before we're even gone." And then he shut the door in such a tightly controlled way it was obvious he wanted to slam it. Logan stared at the door, his throat tightening and his stomach churning. Something purple fluttered to the bed, and Logan's eyes followed the spot of color. The Christmas roses laid around him, limp from being forcibly yanked from the headboard. More flowers were growing in their place. But they weren't hellebore. This time, they were hyacinth. Roman hovered just inside the trees behind Logan's house. It was barely spring, and there was next to no foliage to hide him, so he'd found a dense thicket of brambles to hunker down behind. He had no idea if Mr. and Mrs. Sanders knew Logan went to the full moon revels, though he sincerely doubted it. But even if they did, Roman doubted they'd be on board with Roman going. And the last thing he needed was for them to call Mamaw after he went to all the trouble of sneaking out without her noticing. Not that she seemed to be very concerned about where he was lately anyway. As the sun began to set, Roman saw movement in the window of Logan's room. It opened, and in a surprisingly graceful move, Logan stepped out onto the branch right outside it, just as if he was walking down a sidewalk. It bent underneath him, almost like it was consciously lowering him to the ground, and Logan took one more step and landed in the grass. He paused then, cocking his head like he was listening for something. When he seemed satisfied by whatever he heard, he strode into the trees. He was moving fairly quickly, and Roman didn't really know how to get there, if he even could, without Logan, so once he was fairly certain nobody would see them out the back windows, he called out, a little quieter than he normally would have. "Logan?" Logan jumped like he'd stuck his finger in an electric socket. "Marie Curie and her fucking notebook!" It took Logan a moment to recover, and Roman hesitated, baffled. "Sorry?" he said. "Where did you come from?" demanded Logan. Well, you see, when a mama hillbilly and a dad—" "Don't be obtuse," Logan snapped. "How did you sneak up on me?" Roman shrugged helplessly. "Hate to break it to you, Startles Darwin, but I haven't the faintest idea what you're talking about. I was only sitting here, behind the bush. There was nothing particularly clandestine about it." Logan eyed him warily. "I will admit," he said, voice carefully even, "I was not expecting you to still be coming." Roman winced. "In fact, I was fairly certain you and Patton would not be speaking to me in the future at all." Roman rubbed the back of his neck. There was a lot of things Roman could have said. That he understood, for one. How could he hold Logan to a higher standard than he did himself? Thinking they knew the best solution and not consulting anybody else before doing it was a character flaw they definitely had in common. Logan had hurt Patton. Roman could still see Patton's betrayed expression in his mind's eye. But the picture wavered and became Logan's. Roman could practically feel the confession retreat back into his heart. "It's really important that I go to this," he said lamely. Logan shrunk in on himself, so slightly Roman definitely wouldn't have noticed if he wasn't acutely aware of everything about Logan near constantly. Roman's hand was reaching out before he could stop it. But Logan was already turning away, walking into the underbrush. "Fine. Follow me." Roman did. The woods were as recognizable as they ever were, and Roman was more familiar with them than most. But the longer they walked, the stranger it became. The trees grew more bent and gnarled, and they started to go out of season, some in full spring bloom, others in lush summer green, and even a few in a riot of autumn fire. Logan kept throwing what he probably thought were subtle glances back at Roman, and his shoulders were climbing higher and higher. Roman took a moment to feel spectacularly guilty for putting Logan in such a position. The air was thick with tension, nearly cloying. Roman opened his mouth, clueless as to what he was going to say, but knowing he couldn't bear the oppressive silence a second longer. But the voice that broke the quiet was not his. "Turn back." Roman's blood froze. The voice, a girl's, was familiar, and strangely doubled, like a barely noticeable echo. Bizarrely familiar, so much so that it instantly set his teeth on edge and his mind scrambling for where he'd heard it before. "Turn around, Roman." Roman spun toward the voice, heart hammering, but there was nobody there. It was young, his own age probably, and distinctly irritated. Whoever she was angry. "You could try cooperating for once in your life," she said dryly. Logan seemed to notice that Roman had stopped dead. He turned back, frowning and taking a few steps back toward him. "Roman, is something the matter?" Roman stared, bewildered. "You can't hear that?" Because other than the dual quality of it, almost like a delayed speaker, The voice didn't actually sound supernatural. It really just sounded like someone talking to him. The only other unnatural thing about it was that there didn't seem to be anyone actually there. Hear what? No, he can't, said the voice wearily. Can we please skip this? Who are you? Roman asked the open air. Someone trying to stop you from making a huge mistake, she answered. You aren't ready. Ready for what? He demanded. Telling you would defeat the purpose of informing you aren't ready, dumbass, she said dryly. Roman, who are you talking to? Said Logan, who was beginning to look very alarmed. I'm not taking directions from someone who won't even show herself, said Roman, trying to infuse his voice with all the bravado he definitely wasn't actually feeling. There was a long pause. He couldn't hear a sigh, but somehow he definitely felt like there was one. Trust me when I say it will be better for everyone if you just go home and go to sleep, she said quietly. I think not trusting disembodied voices is the most basic of self-preservation skills, so no thank you. She did sigh then. You always did have to make everything as difficult as possible, she said, resigned and a little bitter. You never listen. Not to me, not to May, not Patton or Logan. It's exhausting, she spat. Roman whirled in a circle once more, trying to pinpoint where the voice was coming from, squinting through the tree trunks in the dim twilight for any indication of a body, a silhouette, or a flash of color, but there was nothing. Who are you? He demanded again. There was no response. Roman, said Logan, his voice significantly higher than it normally was. Roman turned to him. You really couldn't hear her. I heard nothing except you making nonsensical comments to thin air, said Logan tightly. Roman felt like his head was split clean down the middle. On the one hand, he hadn't been lying. Not trusting disembodied voice was pretty much rule number 1, no matter what handbook you were reading. But on the other, he already knew this was a pretty terrible idea. And he knew that voice as well. No matter how much he tried to rack his brain, he couldn't recall from where. It was like trying to catch fish with his bare hands. Every time he brushed against what felt like an answer, it slipped out of his reach, leaving him empty-handed and unbearably frustrated. Roman looked around once more, but when he still didn't see anything, he squared his shoulders and started forward again. Nothing for it, I guess. Are you insane? Demanded Logan. You honestly think it's a good idea to follow through with this plan when you are either hallucinating or being tailed by some kind of supernatural being that interacts exclusively with you? I don't really have a choice, said Roman. For reasons you have yet to explain to me, said Logan. Roman let out a short scream of frustration. I said I'd tell you, and I will, but I'm not even sure what's going on myself. I have to figure this out first. Logan's mouth turned down in distaste. Fine, he spat. Can you at least attempt to listen to me when we are there? I know cooperation is not one of your strong suits. You're one to talk, Roman snarked back. But yes, fine, whatever. Logan didn't look like he believed him in the slightest, but he did look rather resigned to his fate anyway. You're going to be the death of me, he sighed, exasperated. He gestured for Roman to follow, and this time he walked slower, staying much closer than he had been before. It was several minutes later, as the flickering orange glow of a bonfire came just in sight, that Roman's heart twisted with realization. It was never pleasant to hear something like that from a friend, but it was especially depressing when you knew they believed it to be true. But before he could say anything, Logan visibly steadied himself, took Roman by the hand, and led him into the revel. He kept a firm grip on Roman's hand as they walked through the clearing. His hand was cool, but not unbearably so, and every time another Fae moved too close, Logan gave Roman's hand a reassuring squeeze, guiding Roman so Logan was between him and everyone else. Now was a supremely terrible time for Roman to be distracted by how gay he was, but such was his lot in life. Logan had them skirting around the edges of the crowd of Fae, obviously trying to keep Roman out of anyone's direct line of sight. But despite his best efforts, they were definitely being noticed. Whispers and giggles began to pick up, voices faint and amused. Look at that! He's brought a plaything. How quaint. Is that who I think it is? Roman zeroed in on that comment, but Logan was leading him too quickly for him to pinpoint it. He looked around for the voice, but what he ended up focusing on was the raised dais on the other end of the clearing. The Serpent King sat atop it, glaring directly at him. Roman made some kind of terrified noise and jerked his head forward, almost involuntarily pressing closer to Logan. "What's wrong?" Logan demanded immediately, turning back to Roman and shifting so Logan was between Roman and most of the crowd. "What happened?" "Nothing," Roman lied, poorly. Logan gritted his teeth in obvious frustration. He took another step closer, ducking in so they were nearly nose to nose, and Roman's heart was determined to be hammering for all the wrong reasons, apparently. "How can you possibly expect me to get both of us through this idiotic venture alive if you refuse to—" "Well, isn't the cuckoo in a mood?" Logan tensed, whirling on the Fae who spoke. He wore light armor, and Roman eyed the blade at his hip warily. Logan was scowling furiously. "We are not interested in conversing with you," he spat, moving to pull Roman away. "Easy, snow melt," mocked the knight, and Roman felt a flash of confusion when Logan flinched. "I'm not here for you, anyway." Logan snarled, territorial and completely inhuman, which should have been terrifying, but instead just made something flip in Roman's stomach and his cheeks burn bright red. The knight grinned, totally unconcerned, and turned to look at Roman. "The king wants to see him," he said sweetly, "so looks like you'll just have to deal, snow melt." Roman resisted the urge to bolt like a startled rabbit, but only barely. He squared his shoulders, squeezed Logan's hand once, and then dropped it. "It'll be fine," he muttered, but it didn't do anything to mitigate the panic on Logan's face. His eyes darted between Roman and the knight, but he and Roman both knew there was nothing he could do. "Be careful," Logan finally said, begged really, and Roman gave him the most reassuring smile he could manage, which, unfortunately, probably wasn't very reassuring at all. The knight rolled his eyes. "If anyone needs to be careful tonight, it's definitely you, Snowmelt." Roman and Logan exchanged baffled looks, but before they could say anything else, the knight had walked away, gesturing impatiently for Roman to follow. The walk across the clearing felt like marching toward a firing squad. It didn't help that he was still being stared at, the faces around him ranging from amusement to outright bafflement, neither of which made sense. As they approached the dais, the Serpent King stood, turned, and made his way down the steps to the back of it. Roman felt another wave of confusion when the knight gestured for Roman to follow the king into the curtained-off area, but made no move to go in himself. Roman glanced back at Logan, who hadn't moved from the spot he was in and was still staring intently at him, looking like he'd rather have Roman do just about anything than go out of his line of sight. Roman winced and broke their eye contact, clenched his fists, and pushed back into the curtained space. There had to be some kind of magic on this area, Roman thought. Instantly, the sound of the crowd and the music were muffled, as if he'd walked into an actual room rather than just past what amounted to a sheet hung on a rope. Standing next to a smaller fire with his arms crossed, still glaring, was the Serpent King. "You don't listen very well, do you, my dear?" he said sharply. Roman felt distinctly wrong-footed. What kind of opening statement was that? The Serpent King sighed, exasperated. He stalked forward, and Roman tensed, but he felt rooted to the spot, unable to run. "I've repeatedly told you not to come here on the full moon, and not only did you ignore me, you showed up with the changeling." Roman barely had a moment to think that he'd had exactly one conversation with the Serpent King, and considering Roman vividly relived it almost constantly, he was fairly certain the king had said no such thing, but the Serpent King was already talking again. "You are by far the most disobedient pet I have," he said, but his voice had taken on a strange note, irritated but not angry, or even vindictive. In fact, he sounded almost fond? "Whatever," he continued, either not caring or not noticing that Roman was staring at him in absolute bewilderment. "I'm sure I'll figure out some way to deal with him." That spurred Roman to action, heart seizing with fear at whatever the Serpent King intended to do with Logan. He lurched forward and grabbed the Serpent King's sleeve. He was not expecting the Serpent King to grin, raising his hands to cup Roman's face. "Oh, fine," he said. "I suppose it has been days since I've seen you." Nothing about this conversation made sense, if it could be called a conversation, seeing as Roman had done nothing but stare, gobsmacked, but it didn't compare even slightly to what happened next, which is that the Serpent King pulled Roman forward and kissed him. Roman went absolutely still, petrified. His mind was spinning, grasping at something that seemed just out of reach. This was familiar. Too familiar. The feel of the king's cool lips and his hands on Roman's jaw, the smell of his clothes and the fire, all of it. This had happened before, Roman was sure of it. He knew this wasn't the first time the Serpent King had kissed him, but it obviously wasn't the second either, or even the third or fourth. Half of him still felt rooted to the spot, but growing louder and louder was some kind of bizarre sense of calm, a whisper in the back of his brain. Relax, just relax, calm down, it's fine. The king finally seemed to notice that Roman was frozen to the spot, because he drew back, his eyebrows knitted together in confusion. Roman was glad for it, because he was horrified to realize that, with that insistent voice in his head, he was fairly certain he'd just been about to kiss the king back. "Is there a problem?" the king drawled. Roman felt like the answer was just on the tip of his tongue, familiar again like muscle memory. "What do you mean? Don't be silly, just kiss me." Roman threw himself backwards, because he was definitely about to kiss the king that time, and the thought alone made his stomach revolt with nausea. The Serpent King let him slip out of his arms with very little resistance. He continued to peer curiously at Roman, and then a slow smile spread across his face. "I see," he said, tilting his head in a clearly amused way. "You're not my Roman, are you?" What a silly question. Who else could I possibly belong to? "I'm not anyone's anything," said Roman, but the fact that his voice and hands were both still shaking probably ruined the defiance of it. The Serpent King laughed. "You're the Roman of the daytime," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "I was hoping to put that off for at least another few months, but of course you can't just stay away from trouble, can you?" Roman thought fleetingly of the voice in the woods and shuddered. The Serpent King stepped forward and grabbed Roman's hand, ignoring Roman's attempts to get away, pulling him towards the fire and gesturing for him to sit. "Calm down, darling. I won't kiss you again until you ask." "Until," he said, thought Roman hysterically. "Until, not unless." "I'm sure you're going to be ridiculous if I offer you something to drink as well, so I won't bother." He sat next to Roman on the gilded love seat, not touching, but close enough that Roman could feel the air shift whenever he moved. He was still grinning, like this was the funniest thing that happened all week. "Ask away," he said. "I'm very curious as to what you're going to start with." "You know me," Roman blurted, horrified. "That's not a question," the king chuckled. "But yes, darling, I know you very well, in more ways than one." Roman didn't even want to think about the implications of that comment, especially paired with the very obvious once-over that accompanied it. His skin crawled. "How?" he said desperately. The Serpent King leaned over, still not touching, but just that made Roman want to recoil, even as something mutinous in him demanded he lean into the other boy's space. "I am very generous," he said, his cool breath fanning over Roman's face. "This way, you serve me, but you get to keep your silly mortal life." He laid his hand on Roman's cheek, and Roman's traitorous body automatically leaned into it before he could restrain himself. "Every night," he said softly, "from the moment your head touches your pillow until the sun rises at dawn, you are my Roman, my favorite knight, my champion. And then, in the day, you forget," he said simply. "You go about your little life in your little town, blissfully unaware. It's a very good system." Good system for who? Roman thought bitterly, because there was nothing blissful about living in terror of being abducted every day. But however weirdly affectionate the Serpent King seemed to be, Roman knew that would be an idiotic thing to say out loud. But it made a sick sort of sense. Roman had known he'd lost time the morning the prince had woken. But this was so much worse than anything he might have thought was happening. I should have known you wouldn't be able to stay away from me, the king smirked. Even without your memories in your pretty little head, your heart still knows who you belong to. Roman lurched backwards, leaning away over the arm of the seat behind him. I don't belong to anybody, least of all you. The king laughed. Then why are you here, Roman? He said, clearly delighted by Roman's reticence. If you thought yourself still free, is this not the worst place you could possibly have come to? Roman's train of thought stumbled. Think about it, the king continued, his voice mocking. It's really not a good plan at all. I might have forgotten entirely, and you showing up would have reminded me. Or I might have been insulted by your lack of patience. He kept moving forward as he spoke, until he was hovering over Roman, who was still leaning back slightly. You missed me, darling, he teased, delighted. Don't worry. It's endearing, if a little pathetic, how in love with me you are. Roman's fear instantly twisted in on itself, turning acidic and furious. I am not in love with you, he spat. He wasn't sure of much right now, but he knew that at least. Roman knew love, knew it in blonde curls and quicksilver eyes, in the sputter of an old truck and a clearing untouched by fear. He couldn't possibly be in love with someone he was this terrified of. Whatever was drawing him to this snake was something else entirely. It had to be. I wouldn't love someone like you, he continued, and this time he didn't even care that that was an incredibly stupid thing to say to the most powerful fae in the forest. But the Serpent King just laughed again. He didn't even move from where he was still hovering over Roman. Someone like me, he cooed. Oh, Roman, darling, you are far more like me than you think. What is that supposed to mean? In fact, you're probably more like me than the changeling is. The king charged on as if Roman hadn't spoken. Your body may be mortal, but in your heart, you're one of us. You have been since the moment I brought you here. That's not true, said Roman, but his confidence was rapidly plummeting, because it wasn't like the king could lie. The Serpent King seemed to be perfectly aware of Roman's train of thought, grinning. You have delighted in all our games, all our tricks. You've led mortals into traps, had me lay curses on them or enchant them to amuse you. No, Roman could feel tears threatening, his throat closing. I wouldn't. But you would, the king cooed. You already did. Roman was trembling. He couldn't stop, no matter how hard he tried, and he couldn't seem to muster the strength to push the Serpent King off of him. Would you like to see? Said the Serpent King softly. I wouldn't lie to you, of course, darling, but maybe you should see for yourself. He would almost sound gentle, understanding, if it weren't for the sickening smile on his face. He was enjoying this, Roman realized, delighting in Roman's panic, in his uncertainty. But maybe the king was misleading Roman somehow, saying something technically true but hoping Roman was misunderstanding. Maybe if Roman saw for himself, he would see the trick. Cautiously, he nodded. The Serpent King smiled, running his hand up the side of Roman's throat and face until his palm rested against Roman's temple. Roman tried to restrain his shudder of revulsion and failed miserably. Close your eyes, said the king. Roman stared into the king's mismatched irises, torn between his horrified curiosity and his terror at the idea of making himself so vulnerable. But there was only forward or back. He definitely couldn't go back. He quickly scrunched his eyes closed, and the Serpent King dug his nails into the side of Roman's head. His body instantly went loose and pliant, his head tipping and his ears roaring, and then he fell.